Good afternoon, I guess it is. I'm Rob. I'm from Dallas, where I'm the deputy director. Bruce is principal at USD Design and MACH Consulting. And Bruce and our team at the Dallas Museum of Art worked really closely together to create a project called DMA Friends. And so some of you may have heard us give a talk on it last year, so we'll try not to rehash all of that, but we will give you at least a little bit of coverage. But I do want to set the plate a little bit first to make sure we're all on the same page. How many of you in the room are working on projects with measurement and metrics? Could we have you raise your hand? Okay. So the question we started with was this one: how do you measure things that you can't see? And for many of us in museums, we're critically worried about the impact that our museums are having on our audiences. And for us in art museums, many times that impact is purely internal. It's a very personal experience. Sometimes it's all inside your head. Sometimes there are impacts that happen months or years later, and you may or may not ever know about them. So how do you, as a museum, figure out if you're doing a good job? That's sort of the critical question and where we started. After that, I come from a technology background. Bruce comes from many backgrounds, technology among them. But we think about systems, and you think about the museum as a system. And in the museum, if you take the whole thing, the people, the building, the collections, the tech, is it possible to build a platform where you could get better at engaging your users over time, and that would help your museum actually know that it was happening and prove it? Could we start, and I think this is a lot about what we talk here at this conference, could data be used by the whole of the staff, not only to prove that these things were happening, but also to get better at it over time? Because in fact, we know that we are engaging users because they tell us stories about how they've connected with our museum every day. And I'm certain that every single one of you in the room has a story that you could tell me about how somebody has really benefited from visiting your museum. But there's all sorts of things we do that don't have that impact. So how do we know what they are? How do we know the ones that are really succeeding? And then how do we pick apart what was it about that successful program that actually made the difference, so that we could apply that learning to something that's not as successful? That's what we're going after. It's easy. So let me tell you a little bit about, that was a joke, folks. Let me tell you a little bit about the Dallas Museum of Art. So Dallas is, and North Texas in general, is really blessed with an awful lot of great museums. The DMA is among them. It stands as the largest art museum in the region, the only encyclopedic museum in the region. It is now 111 years old, and is really in the center of downtown. So the building is owned by the city. We're very much the city's museum. We receive a lot of benefit from that, not just from tax incentives, but from pride of place and from name recognition. Dallas Museum of Art, that's our name. Dallas, if you're not aware, is not a tourist destination, unless you're a Cowboys fan or a Rangers fan. But we are not drawing lots and lots of cultural tourism. Our primary audiences are, in fact, the people who live within driving distance. In Dallas, that totals about 6.5 million people. Last year, the Census Bureau told us that Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex was the fastest growing metro in all of the United States. It's growing by somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 people each and every day. Our 10-year average attendance in the museum was 485,000 people and remained flat for 10 years. We had tremendous investments in some very large exhibitions that would spike us up for 1 year, and then the very next year we'd be back to 485,000. So while the city is booming, the museum is flat. 8%. We are reaching no more than 8% of our possible audience. And that audience is growing and we're staying flat, so we're shrinking, we're losing this battle. So we decided to try to get under the hood, and I want to issue a caveat here that the things we're going to talk to you about today, we are still learning. This is not the end of the story, and we designed the entire system, and the entire approach for Friends was a system for learning ourselves. So we are learning about what the right metrics are for us. They may or may not be right for you, but what are the right metrics for us? And how good are we doing? How can we capture them? All of these things. So we decided on 4 to start with. One, we decided that repeat visits were more important than raw attendance, because it's really easy to get somebody in the door once, and it's relatively more difficult to get them in the door twice, and then even more difficult than that to get them in the door 3 times. But in fact, if you really want to change this number, what you need is a set of passionate people who see your museum as their home. So we think repeat visits is really important. We are measuring ourselves against the diversity of participation, so it's not enough that somebody only shows up for the party we throw on Fridays, but we'd also like them to visit the permanent collection. We want to see that they go to the education spaces. We want to know that they sometimes attend lectures. And so that visit diversity is something that we're looking at, but think about that for a second. That means that you have to know a person, as an individual, not as a group, not as a cluster, not as a segment. If we're doing a good job, we ought to increase the affinity that our visitors feel for us over time. They ought to like us better, and they ought to like art more if we're doing a good job. We think that's pretty important. And we ought to be able to issue sort of calls and responses. If we have a platform that works, we ought to be able to say, hey, let's design it to do this thing, and see that it actually does that thing. So that's what I mean, ability to motivate action. I'm going to hand off to Bruce, and Bruce is going to talk a little bit about what we did.
Yeah, I have to admit there's a little bit of personal experimentation that I want to do for a moment, is to see how quickly I can talk and if the prompter will keep up with what I can do. I'm a little fascinated by just watching the words actually appear on the screen at the very, that's practically, all right. So anyway, let's talk about DMA Friends and what we built a year ago. The picture is relevant. That's the Titanic. Everybody was hopeful at the start that it was a good project. Clearly it didn't end in a good way. We think we're in a better spot than that. So if that's our baseline of standard, we're feeling pretty good about where we are. The core of it was we needed a bunch of different things to actually come into play throughout the museum. And part of it was changing the overall visitor experience and what people begin to encounter in the museum. But at the core of it, in addition to a bunch of human process and changing the way the museum works, there is some basic kit behind it. There is some technology that everybody interfaces with and you interact with. When you come into the museum, there are a series of iPads, and these are the iPads you sign up for DMA Friends on, you get acclimated to what the system is, and you can learn about the general program and what we have to offer. So, relatively straightforward, off-the-shelf hardware, probably the best mobile platform that exists in existence right now, and primarily chosen as an interface because it's an all self-contained, all-in-one experience, right? So there's a camera in it, there's a multi-touch sensory input, there's a Wi-Fi capability, and in terms of trying to develop other infrastructure, you can't get much cheaper and more reliable than this. So, when you start to join DMA Friends, everybody gets to see a dashboard. There's some basic background information. We try and break it down into basic activities. The notion behind DMA Friends, it's mostly about transactional relationships with the museum. And by transactional relationships, we look at the different kinds of people that come to the museum and what their motivations were to participate and engage with the museum. And it's essentially broke down into 2 different categories. There are those that are motivated by giving, and there are those that are motivated by, I want a membership because I want a discount or I want to get additional people in. And so a lot of what we have here is actually geared toward that basic transactional motivation. And we break it down to give you activities that you do in the museum. And as you engage with the museum, you can check in to DMA Friends, and you get credit for doing that. It is at some level a basic loyalty program. But the important thing that we tried to do all along it, and this is based on a conversation with some people that had helped with the airline industry, is you want to make sure you incentivize the right things, right? Because the thing that we want to do is not necessarily give people a lot of points for doing stuff, but it's rather that they have engaged with the museum. Right? And the conversation with the airline industry was along the lines of the fatal flaw that the airline industry had started some 30 years ago was you get points for actually flying a lot of miles, which is not what the airline industry wants. They want you to spend money with them. Right? And so you'll start to see a shift that's happening now where when you spend more money with the airlines, that's how you're actually going to earn your miles, right? So they don't want you to fly lots of miles, and we don't want you here to come here and just do a lot of stuff at the museum. We actually want to value the participation that you're going to do. So when you first log into the system, there's a basic set of background information about things that you can do at the museum, which are really the activities that you can participate in, the things that you can check in at. There's a wide variety of them. We customize them fairly extensively, and the bigger part of that is actually working with the organization to figure out what are the kind of experiences that we can incentivize, that we can recognize that people will do, and actually begin to modify some of the behavior that's going to happen in the galleries. Because as we do any one of these things, we want to become a little bit of a personal quest, right? The badges that you may receive as a part of it are more of a byproduct of what you have done, not the deliberate goal. Don't go get the badges, but go do stuff, and you earn badges as a result of it, right? And it's a subtle, tricky balance there, but it's an important one because we want the motivation to be on the experience that you do, not the direct benefit that you get from that. Any of these badges can be done in a number of different ways. There can be multiple stops. We can combine things in different quantities. We can look at have multiple steps within individual badges. And we tried to develop a system that is fairly extensible, that meets all the potential scenarios that we could ever dream of. And for the most part, we seem to have done well. One of the things that we know after the first year, there are some basic modifications that we need to do to the environment, but this has been relatively sustainable, and as we begin to think about how to make it grow, it seems to work out pretty well. There's also integration with cell phones, and we very deliberately made it a cell phone integration where it's not necessarily you have to use you could use a mobile device, a smartphone, and actually use a mobile interface, but it ended up being that texting was pretty important because we realized there's a large population that have old phones that will all disappear one day. Those people will die. We'll have a new generation of people that come to the museum. But in the meantime, we still want to accommodate that, right? And it turns out that the basic interface for texting simple little codes to a server actually works very well. It's very reliable and sustains well. And we actually have most of the activity that happens that way. So a basic architecture, and we used to have a much more complex diagram that we're not going to show anymore, is at the core of it. DMA Friends is a WordPress installation. And on top of that, we've worked with Learning Times out of New York to develop Badge OS, which sits on top of it, which powers all of this. Essentially, DMA Friends runs through Badge OS, which is a huge plugin for WordPress. And that experience is what's the front-facing side for almost everybody. There's Twilio to integrate with the mobile devices that you have there, and that's a relatively simple, straightforward back and forth. All the front-end experience is on a responsively designed site, so it's actually once we developed it for an iPad or for any mobile device, we can broadly apply it across a number of different things. In order to integrate it with other systems, we had originally this very complex scenario, and as Jane will attest, trying to get multiple systems to talk to each other and be aware of each other is brutally difficult and hard. And so we went back to an older technology where we printed out coupons. Because it's very easy for somebody to say, oh, you get a discount here at the shop, I can just punch that into my register, and we never had the different systems talk to each other. But the key bit of integration there was that when you're at a DMA Friends kiosk, there is an integrated little printer in the furniture underneath you, and you can get spit out little coupons for particular things. I should add that any of the rewards that you go for there's a fairly good laundry list of potential things that people can take advantage of. And one part of the benefit to be that you could customize the things that you wanted. You get to choose the benefits that you want rather than just offering a blanket set of stuff. And so it ends up being relatively simple and straightforward. As with most WordPress installations, they're MySQL backend, and so the data is stored in a relatively large container. And that's allowed us to actually do a lot of custom analytics against the stuff that we have. We've been using Chartio for the last year, chart.io if you go to it. It's a subscription service with a nominal fee that does a really good job of taking complex data sets and making them look interesting and allowing you to do good complex queries and make it sustainable. The bonus of it having a good MySQL architecture is that we can actually do different sets of analysis tools on top of that. In fact, we've been doing that. But Tableau has been used a lot more in the last couple of months as a kind of a next generation of what's possible. But all of these things end up being kind of plug-in components that we can flex back and forth. So, launch day, a little over a year ago.
And yes, that is the Titanic launching. And so, yeah, we've completed our maiden voyage, as it were. We've been running for a little bit over a year. We launched in January 21st of 2013. So I'm going to speed up a little bit and throw a lot of data at you right now. I'll apologize for that in advance, but the data is all written up in the paper, which is online. It's also on our website, and you can download it and play with it if you want to. So we're going to get into this. So this is a look at the Backend Chart.io interface. This is what is up at the front desk, and every visitor services staff member keeps track of this almost every 5 minutes. They're watching this. And so part of what we're doing is training the staff how to integrate data and decision making in their own time. So as of this morning, we had 58,407 friends. These are people who would physically visit, be greeted by a person at the museum, and agree to sign up and participate in this. So in just a little more than a year, 58,000 folks. That's an annual attendance of about 550,000 people, and our prior membership program was 22,000 people. We can track all sorts of things about friends' participation, when are they coming, how are they coming back. What we do is we count a friend's visit, which is completely optional, right? You can come to the museum, you either choose or don't choose to tell us that you're here, and the very choice of telling us that you're here is a factor of engagement. If we're doing a good enough job offering you value, making your life easy, then you'll tell us that you're here. So we've had about 84,000 of those visits since launching, 40,000 since October 1. The graph down below here, you can see the blue lines are signups of new friends. The yellow lines are all repeat visits of friends who are coming back to do things. So the repeat visits are smaller than the new friends signups, but in an aggregate basis for all friends across the population, about 10 to 11% repeat their visit. But on a daily basis, that number is between 35 and 50%. So what the difference there is that some people are visiting an awful lot. You can see that we track the kinds of rewards we give away. Free parking is our most popular reward. That still works out good for us. There's no tangible cost for us to give you the ability to park in our garage. There's an opportunity cost, perhaps. We are tracking each and every activity that an individual does. So who does it, where were they when they did it, what time was it, who were they with. And again, this is all completely opt-in. The most popular activities include, of course, visiting the museum. Loving a work of art. We teach people how to read accession numbers on our object labels, and they can text us the accession number to register works of art that they love. Bringing other people with them, we're trying to incentivize that behavior. So bringing other people with them is a really frequent behavior, as are, a little bit to our surprise, visits to the permanent galleries. That by designing badges that have creative ways of packaging those experiences together, like taking a trip around the world, we are incentivizing people to travel into permanent collection galleries that they wouldn't normally go to, and that, since the launch of the program, has been an extremely popular activity. It's also easy to understand. There's no trick there, people get it immediately. So I say we have, a lot of people are pitching this as a big data problem, and it is big data for museums, but not really big data in the corporate sense of big data. For us, we're generating about 1 million rows of user activity on 60,000 users. The user profile fields have somewhere in the range of 20 or so fields there. And then we have a system log that somewhat overlaps that activity stream of another 1 million rows. So it's not large in the sense of petabytes large, but it is large in complexity. So the kinds of queries and analysis you want to do get very complicated at this scale. And this is going to grow perpetually. So what kinds of things are we learning? This is a look, and again, the URL at the top here, dma.org/friends/by-the-numbers. This is where you can play with these graphs and even get into some of the underlying data. But these are the friend recruiting trends. The blue lines are the weekly numbers of recruits, which have hovered right around 1,000 people a week. And then the green line is our running total. So you can see that slope on that green line is remarkably steady. It's not tailing off, and it didn't start much faster and then slow down. So the slope of that line is really important to us. This is the same data looked at a little bit differently. So the black bars across here are, I think it's a 12-week rolling average. So we use this to see trends. So you can see in the springtime, right in here, we started to change the way that we were pitching the program to visitors through the front door. And this is when our front of house staff and our gallery attendants really came into the ownership of the project as a way to engage audiences, and they really began to own it, and you can actually see the result in the increase of that rolling average. So they figured, you know, we started here, and that average dipped a little bit. We kind of noodled around to figure out what the right way to work was, and then they figured it out. So here, there's a lot of increase. And then so over, I guess this was the fall, they kept working their system. And then just recently, we've experimented with a few different kinds of pairings and a few, because we really wanted to try to drive repeat visits. So we started to watch for friends who were coming back as repeats. Funny enough, this actually also impacted our new recruits, which was unanticipated, but you can see it in the data. This is the multicolored dream bar chart. And only thing to say here is that we're tracking each and every activity that happens on each and every day. And what you might see is some big lumps that show up in here. This is when we finally figured out how to start promoting the love a work of art thing. So I saw some of you cringe when I said we told people how to read accession numbers on object labels. Well, not surprising. That was hard to do, and it took us a while to figure out how that actually worked. And you can see in the data that we got it right around in the fall. So that's when we started to see an explosion of people then texting into us about works of art. Here's a graph that shows us reward redemption, and this one is Bruce's favorite graph because what we tried here, notice the blue bars. This blue bar here are, we give you free exhibition tickets if you earn a certain number of points. So you can come in and see the show for free, which would normally cost you between $8 and $16. What we did in the winter, in December of this year, is we were having some exhibition attendance that was below what we wanted it to be. And so we called out to these 60,000 DMA friends and said, hey friends, guess what? If you've got 1,000 points, you can come to see this exhibition for free. And they did. So this was an example of that call and response. We created an occasion for them to do something. We rewarded the people who were participating with us the most, and we created a bounded time window. This was a 3-week only opportunity. So you can see in those 3 weeks that that call and response really happened in a dramatic way.
You know, the reason that I'm in love with that actually is we knew early on that DMA Friends was going to be about watching what museum visitors did, and being aware of what people did in a way that we never did before. The thing that's a secondary part of that, it's not enough to watch. You actually have to influence behavior. And that we're able to see so directly that we can do some very simple and subtle things in the organization, and that people respond in mass and enthusiastically and willingly is incredibly compelling, because that means that this is an incredibly powerful tool for the museum to do stuff with visitors. I love this graph.
All right, Jane gave me the high five sign, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. This is a look at every single friend who has visited more than once since the launch of the program. What you can't see is that the axis on this end tops out at 200 visits. And at the bottom end here, this is 20 visits. So can you imagine in that enabling a new member of your audience who will come back 20 times in 1 year? That's a lot, right? 5 times is a lot. Let alone these super friends who are up here at the 150 to 200 range. Those are incredibly passionate users, and you ought to know them individually, if not by name. So this is a map. One of the ways we're using this data, we ask you optionally to give us your zip code. We're inferring lots of things about zip code. In addition to place, we get great joins against census data for a rough guess of demographic splits and a rough guess of educational, and even just something as basic as commute time from a zip code. Commute time is a really significant factor to consider about why people may or may not be visiting your museum. So this is just a normalization of the population of friends against the population of the zip code. So in this graph, gray is good, okay? Gray is an even split on those things. So a zone that's green tips the scale where we have proportionately more friends than the population says we should, and red says we have proportionately less friends than the population says we should. So you start to see a couple of interesting things. For those of you that know Dallas-Fort Worth is in the west, so these red zones over here are all red. Now, you might guess that this is because Dallas and Fort Worth don't like each other, but I like Fort Worth. But if you were in Fort Worth and you wanted to go to an art museum, there are 3 or 4 really great art museums that are much closer than the Dallas Museum of Art. So that's going to impact that graph, okay? Now we're using it also to look at zones like this one. This is close to where I live, but it's an area called Frisco, and it's just this booming area. But we're not doing a very good job of drawing people from Frisco to come to the art museum. Well, why is that? We don't know yet, but that's what we're looking into. All right, so this is Bobby Kaufman. Some of you have heard me tell this story before, but we thought Bobby was cheating us, and we were wrong. Bobby quickly sailed to the top of the lists, right? He was earning zillions of points. He was our first, really high reward earners. And so instead of accusing him of cheating, which would have been a bad idea, we invited him over for lunch and said, hey, could you come over and we'll buy you lunch and you tell us how you're using Friends. Turns out he's a high school English teacher, and the museum was on his commute home. So rather than sitting in traffic every day, he would get out of school, he would park on the street, pop a quarter in the meter, and zip into the galleries for 30 to 45 minutes. So he was using this as what he called his daily dose of art. So that's exactly what we want to have happen. And that's the sort of person, that's the way we want people to think about using the museum. And that's Bobby. No joke. That's Bobby, and this is what he does when he comes to our museum. Those are that same stripy chart. So we can see that there's some variation there. He's actually not really gaming us. He just has things that he likes to do. This is another great example. We try to do what we call boutique rewards. So this one was actually a boutique. And this woman's husband was an avid friend and used his points to buy his wife a present where she could do the art beauty shop reward. So we have this painting which is behind them, which is a 1930s beauty shop. So the reward was come with 5 of your friends and have your hair and makeup done in the style of the painting. And so this was when they did that. And then have your portrait taken by our photographers. Okay, now that didn't cost us very much, right? It only was maybe a couple $100, but a super great opportunity, not just for these people, but all of the other people we talked about this. And now I'm telling all of you about it. So that was well worth the $200.
Right, so one of the things, and I'm going to go faster because we actually are running out of time, is we're looking at the forward-facing element of what we're going to do. We've recognized that we have an interesting problem right now as we go through the data set and we've started collecting real stuff. While it's not actually a big data problem, we have some of the problems that exist there. And like any good startup, we have scaling issues, right? And so at this point, we're looking at how do we actually make WordPress faster? How do we re-architect some of the information data that's existing there? And how can we actually streamline that to make it quicker and better with the amount of data that we know that we're amassing? Because we see it on a daily basis, that we see this low grind of kind of things slowing down in a subtle way, and we need to try and be proactive about changing some of that. So this year, we're going through a fairly extensive overhaul of some of the back-end mechanics of how the system is architected, streamlining much of that. And can we go through this whole next set? Yeah, I'm going to keep going. Yeah, okay, that's good. So as we begin to do that, the question really becomes, how do we make this museum more effective at producing our engaged and invested audiences? And we need to figure out what it means to do that in Dallas, but then eventually we begin to go elsewhere. We have to look at across the rest of the nation. We know the parameters of Dallas. We've made something that works there. We've made it work at the Dallas Museum of Art, which has free admission, and we know how to leverage that. The question becomes, what's that look like in other parts of the country? Every museum is its own unique, special little flower that blooms in its own magical way. Let's go with that and pretend that's true. But everybody has their own individual scenarios, right? That some people will want to do membership in a way that they continue to do. Some will still want to charge admission. Some have different kinds of demographics that need to respond in different ways. And so as we begin to build this out, we have to begin to ask ourselves, what does it mean to do DMA Friends in other locations around the country? Is it a model that is sustainable and repeatable and makes sense everywhere else? So we have an IMLS National Leadership Grant that we have partnered with 4 other museums over the next year to build pilot studies with very different needs and requirements. There is the Grace Museum in Texas. There is LACMA in Los Angeles, it turns out. Minneapolis Institute of Art, again in Minneapolis, as it would seem. And then last of all, the Denver Art Museum, which conveniently is DAM versus DMA, so it's very easy to get those confused in conversation. I told Rob this morning he was from Denver, so that was good. But over the next year, and we'll be developing pilot projects. They'll launch initially in the fall. We're going through the process right now of having identified different use cases. And it's interesting because nobody wants to do the thing that we did except for the Grace. Now, at the core of it, because we know what the data is and we understand how the system works, we're looking at things like how do you make the museum into kind of a digital concierge, that based on the activity of people at the museum, How can you make new recommendations about things to do based on the sort of data that you're collecting? But critical to that was to have a platform that collects all that kind of data in the first place, which is what DMA Friends does at the core of it and does really, really well. And people participate enthusiastically to give you that data. We've given you good incentive to give us that data. The most important outcome that we've learned over the last year is, and we alluded to this a little bit earlier, I'll segue to you in a second, is while we need a strong technology platform, the most pivotal part of the whole thing, and the only reason that DMA Friends is successful, and this is the hard lesson to learn, is because of staff participation and the fundamental changes that changed the way the organization worked and the way they thought about visitors. But to that end.
Yeah, and I'm just going to shorten this for sake of time, but if everything else breaks and goes away, if we throw away all the software and all the tech, if at the end of the day we get a staff who understands how to build a process where they can learn to do their job better, then that was worth however much effort and time we put into it. So what I want you to take away is that this particular approach and this particular software implementation isn't the important part. Building a structure in your museum where your staff can learn, that's way more important. So if you're interested, the code, you can have it and you can do this yourself, and we'd like you to do it. And if you do, we'd like to invite you to aggregate data together with us so that we could get smarter from each other. I want to give you my data. The things that are working in Dallas may work for you. You may discover something that I've never thought of, and I really want to use that. So if you do this, please just tell us about it. So thanks a lot. So the question was, did the genesis of this program coincide with our free admission switch? And it did. So we were making a move to open the museum up. We dropped our admission charge to the permanent galleries, and we said, we want this to be the city's museum. If you want to be here, we want you. And then we said, if you want to belong here, please join us as a member for free.
But you don't have to.
You're not required to. There's no gate. You can walk in anytime you want. People won't hassle you, and participation is entirely optional.
Just in the middle there.
Yes, right there.
How many efficient underwriting, or you something like this product?
We did not have underwriting to start.
Okay.
We decided with our board that it was worth doing. It sacrificed about $1.2 million of annual revenue, earned revenue, and we decided that it was worth foregoing that money to do this. Since that time, we've been awarded about probably $10.5 million in grants and donations specifically connected to either free admission or this Friends program. So you can look at it that way, it's generating funding revenue. But to be respectful to our other presenters, I'll make myself available outside of this room afterwards if anybody else wants to keep talking.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you.